Good afternoon, everyone. As Katie indicated, if you do feel like you'd like a seat and you're not able to sit downstairs in room 64, we're live streaming this and the audio is very good. So if you're somebody that are standing, if your legs are getting tired, please join us downstairs as well. So good afternoon. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Heather Haven, and I'm the Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies here at the College of Law, and I'm also a member of our Speakers Committee. And I am very pleased to be with you today. As we gather here today, we acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. Now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here today to our inaugural event of 2018 of the McKercher Lecture Series. We have a fantastic guest speakers lineup coming up this year, including Professor Janine Benedet from UBC. We have Marilyn Poitras, who is a professor here at the college and former commissioner with the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, who will be exploring spaces for Indigenous process within politics in Canada. We have Jan Martel, the award-winning author of Life of Pi, who will be speaking on storytelling and how stories are a foundation of who we are. And we will have one of our own alumni, Andrew Arruda, who has gone on to co-found a Silicon Valley artificial intelligence company, and he will, as part of our speaker series, be doing a talk in Regina later this semester. So if you're able, please come out to as many of these lectures as possible. We think they're informative and entertaining, and you can always find us on the college's website or Facebook page if you want some more information. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Lisa Watson, who will in turn introduce our panelists. Lisa Watson is a partner with Pesco Watson here in Saskatoon. Her practice focuses on criminal defense and civil litigation, and she has appeared before numerous levels of court. She is a member of the Saskatoon Criminal Defense Lawyers Association and a district governor with the Saskatchewan Trial Lawyers Association. And in 2013, she was named Saskatoon's Best Lawyer by Planet S magazine. And in 2017, she was appointed as a member of the Federal Judicial Advisory Committee for Saskatchewan. She was born and raised in Biggar and is an alumni here of the College of Law, graduating in 2009. So please join me in welcoming Lisa Watson to do the introductions.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon for the first event in the Winter 2018 McKercher Lecture Series and to act as moderator for this very special presentation and panel discussion. Before we begin, I would like to introduce the three panelists that are taking part today. First speaking, we'll have Dr. Michael Szafron. He is an assistant professor at the University of Saskatchewan School of Public Health. He is a graduate of the U of S, completing a PhD focused on developing and studying models for DNA enzyme interactions in 2009. His resultant statistical expertise led to a teaching opportunity at the School of Public Health, and he was hired as an assistant professor with the school in 2012. In addition to his research work on DNA interactions, Michael has an active public health research program, and he is currently the principal investigator on several projects, including investigating the risk factors and establishing the demographics of marijuana use in Canada prior to legalization. Michael will speak on the impacts of marijuana use and the implications particularly for universities. Please welcome Dr. Michael Szafron.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank Dr. Haven for including me in this panel this afternoon. I hope that I have information that you might not have heard before, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. So,
I'm the professor, so I'll make sure that you have it really close to your mouth.
Sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. And so what I want to chat with you about, well, as each one of you knows, the legalization of marijuana has spurred many interesting debates across the country. There are groups who are pro and anti legalization. Each one of those groups has a series of facts that they use to support their position. And many of these facts often relate to how marijuana consumption will impact users in the end. So when I engage people in conversations on this topic, I usually am there for the purpose of debunking myths and hopefully establishing facts about health issues. So one of the things I invariably hear in this conversation is the following. Using marijuana is safe because it's a natural product. It's a plant. How can that hurt you, right? So if you look, the picture on the left is hemlock. The picture on the right is nightshade, and they've been used throughout our history to actually poison people. They're plants, but I don't think anyone would consider them to be safe. So when I mention that to individuals, they'll say to me, Michael, those are poisonous. Marijuana is not toxic. Well, is marijuana toxic becomes a really important question. To know if marijuana is toxic or not, we have to know something about the chemical composition of marijuana. The THC is the compound in marijuana that is responsible for the high that so many people seek. And if you're seeking that high, you're going to go out seeking products that have high levels of THC. So there are many factors that influence then how much THC ends up in an individual's body after consumption. The obvious choices for that are, well, how much did I consume and over what period did I consume it? One factor that's not as well known is how you consume it will also impact the level of THC in your system. So for instance, if I decide to smoke some form, then almost immediately my THC levels rise, okay? If I decide to ingest something like a delicious brownie, then what will happen is the THC will be slowly released into my system. Now the danger here is that when I ingest it, the digestion process is slow. And so I think, I've eaten my brownie, but I'm not feeling anything yet, so I better have another one. And so as a result, you are much more likely to have higher levels of THC in your system through ingestion than from smoking. And another thing that people don't realize is, well, and some people might, is that the actual plant variety or source for the THC also matters. Marijuana today that's sold on the street is quite a bit different from marijuana from the 1960s and 1970s. The marijuana from the 1960s and 1970s had about maybe 1 to 4% THC at most. That's similar to what our current medicinal marijuana has, but right now the most street varieties are about 20% THC. And recently in Colorado, there are some producers who have advertised that they're hitting the 30% mark. So the big question is there actually a level of THC that's toxic? Okay. This is a really difficult question to answer. It's really easy to say, but why is it difficult to answer? Well, the experiment that you could do to determine this is unethical, right? We can't give people boatloads of THC and wait to see how long it takes for them to die. So what we do is we have to make inference from animal studies. What happens, those animal studies, again, there are many limitations to them. The extrapolation back to humans is even more variable. So what ends up happening is, in the literature, you'll find there is a huge range of toxicity levels for THC. One is about 1.4 grams per kilogram. That I'm not going to share with you with the rest of the talk. That's just an upper bound. The one that I like is one that was calculated in 2014, and it's 30 milligrams per kilogram. And the reason this is one that I like to remember is because there is a lot of evidence supporting that this may be a toxic level, and I'll get to that a little bit later. So what does 30 milligrams per kilogram equate to? Well, if I'm a 150-pound individual, which is about my mass, that's 68 kilograms if you're metric, that's 2 grams or a quarter of an ounce, or sorry, 1/14 of an ounce of pure THC. So individuals say, Michael, nobody consumes pure THC. I would have to consume hundreds of pounds of marijuana in order to get that level of THC. Well, this hundreds of pounds of marijuana, it's now removed. It used to be in Wikipedia. Wikipedia said you actually had to contain so many pounds, and it was in the hundreds, but that now has been removed with some other estimates. So what level of marijuana is actually then toxic or equivalent to the THC toxicity? Well, in 2004, a researcher found that just 15 grams, which is about a half an ounce, could be toxic or fatal. Okay? Now, one of the limitations with that study was we had no idea what THC level was involved, and so trying to equate it back to THC was difficult. But if we go to our 30 milligram per kilogram estimate, okay, so imagine I'm 150 pounds, and I decide to go out to the street and buy my 20% THC marijuana. It will result in 10 grams of marijuana possibly being a lethal dose. Okay. Now, how big is 10 grams? Okay. Well, people say no one would consume 10 grams at one time. I had no idea how much 10 grams was. It's about 15 joints, I'm told. No one smokes 15 joints at a time. So as long as you use it in moderation, it is still safe. Well, one of the challenges with marijuana consumption is the THC is fat soluble. That means as I use more marijuana, I can actually accumulate THC in my body. Okay? There is evidence that this THC does accumulate in individuals, and it does become toxic. And it's around the average consumption of the 10 gram dosage, and that's why I stick with this as a fairly safe upper bound or lower bound for what's toxic. And what happened is people started showing up in emergencies with this very strange illness. They had random bouts of nausea and vomiting, yet they learned that if I have a very hot shower or bath, the symptoms go away. Okay? So eventually physicians realized this is actually THC poisoning. This is how it manifests in individuals. So chronic users are showing up with this THC poisoning, and the disease that they name is this cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. Okay. So chronic users then, and that means people who use it in moderation can still be a chronic user. They can have this accumulated THC in their system. That could put them at risk for some major long-term health problems. That could be cognitive impairments that are long-term, and it also could be there are mental health issues that are associated with marijuana consumption. Those mental health illnesses include depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. So people then say to me, well, I know people who have smoked marijuana for years and they're fine. They don't have any mental health issues. And the truth is, that could be correct. There is a large number of people out there that when they consume cannabis products, it has no real impact other than the desired effect, and there are no long-term consequences. But we are beginning to see that there are some groups who are highly at risk for those very severe long-term, whether it's cognitive or mental health side effects. Okay? So what are one of the characteristics of the people who are at risk? the age of consumption. There is a mounting body of evidence that says if people are starting to use marijuana prior to when they finish cognitively developing, they will be at extremely high risk for the long-term cognitive impairments. Okay? What age group is that? Well, low 20s below, right? So 21, 22. By the time the person's 25, most people have finished cognitively developing. So if you want to be conservative, you'd say anyone below 25 could be at risk for long-term cognitive impairments. Okay. Now, again, those who are going to be chronic users are at risk. Okay. What is a chronic user? Well, it's a combination, right, of how much I use, the actual variety I'm using, and the frequency I use. They are going to be at risk for both the cognitive impairments and the mental health issues. And a recent finding is there's actually now a genetic link. So epidemiological studies have shown an association between, if a user has a family history of mental illness and a non-user has a family history of mental illness, the result is the user is more likely than the non-user to develop mental health problems. Okay? So that has been a repeated theme that's been occurring over and over, and so researchers thought, well, is there actually some sort of genetic, are there genes responsible for this? So there are geneticists going out there looking for genes that are related to, say, psychosis, and one of them happens to be the COMT gene, and they have found that with respect to this COMT gene, that this COMT gene, that there are some variations of the gene that if I consume a cannabis product, I have no higher risk for mental health issues. But if I have a different variation of the gene, I am extremely at high risk for having mental health issues. Okay, so they are identifying genes that are activated in a sense by THC. The problem is we don't have any tests for these genes yet. So right now, the best I could advise is if you have a family history of mental health illnesses, you may want to think twice about whether or not you would want to consume, because again, it really will depend on if you technically have this particular genetic combination that leads to it. But without the test, the best we can say is rely on the mental health history in your family. So at the end of the day, it comes down to, like, what then are the impacts of legalization? Well, we have to have policies which govern the usage of marijuana. And so as a result, people will start with their tobacco and alcohol consumption policies as a starting place. And the reason for that is many of the risks associated with marijuana use parallel those for tobacco and for alcohol consumption. But policy development shouldn't stop there, because there is a whole litany of other consequences associated with marijuana usage that differ from both alcohol and tobacco consumption. So there's going to be a possibly huge impact to the cost of our health system after legalization. Prior to legalization, they estimate the cost of mental health to our health system is about $51 billion a year. Okay? So if we end up having more individuals developing mental health issues, that cost is going to go up. Okay? Now, because there is this connection between the age of consumption, between the amount of THC I use, and whether or not I will end up developing one of the long-term negative health effects, I would hope that the government will regulate the amount of THC that can be in a cannabis product. Okay? We already regulate how much nicotine can be in tobacco for health reasons, so I would hope they're going to regulate the amount of THC. I also hope that they're really going to consider a high legal age for use. It should be at least that of the tobacco and alcohol consumption, but I would even be, if I would push for even 21 to be safe. Okay, that's mine. Okay. Now, because there are these negative impacts associated with using marijuana and it's going to be legalized, I feel the government does have a responsibility to educate through health promotion and educational awareness campaigns. They should tell the public the risks associated so people can make informed decisions. Now, again, where does the university and post-secondary institutions fit in this? Well, they are not going to be immune from the effects of legalization. If we think about that group of individuals who happen to be less than 25, who are the group that are at risk for the long-term cognitive impairment, who could be at risk for the long-term mental health illnesses, and that is the very demographic which is one of the largest groups on campus, right? Those who are between 18 and 25. So I feel that universities also will have a responsibility to educate the student body about the risks and harms associated with marijuana. I'll skip the last one. I heard my message. So the big question is, do we know now really enough to understand the long-term implications? And I leave that to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Next up, we have Kevin Wilson, QC. Kevin is a Saskatoon partner with MLT AIKINS LLP. For the last 29 years, he has practiced almost exclusively in the area of management side labor and employment law. Kevin was the founding Saskatchewan director of the Canadian Association of Counsel to Employers, and he is the former chair of the Canadian Bar Association National Labor and Employment Law Section. Kevin has been recognized as a leading lawyer in Best Lawyers in Canada, Lexpert Legal Directory, and Benchmark Canada, and he is a frequent speaker on labor law and human rights law across Western Canada. Kevin is also a proud graduate of the U of S College of Law, and he will be speaking on marijuana impairment and the workplace. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Wilson.
Thanks, Lisa, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be asked to present today at the McKercher Lecture Series. I'm going to be giving you the perspective on legalization of marijuana as it relates to employers. My area of practice is I act for employers in a variety of employment and labor law areas, and this is the hot topic for employers right now for the next 6 months as we move into legalization. So the first question I get asked is, why would an employer care whether an employee is using legal marijuana in July when it becomes legal? And the answer is, I've dealt with dozens of employers on this. No one is treating this as a moral issue, that they're morally opposed to marijuana. That's not part of the debate in the employer community. It's not the perspective that I'm bringing to this. I'm raising some concerns, but I'm doing it from the perspective of the employer's issues with employees using legal marijuana, and not from some sort of moral perspective on whether marijuana is good or bad. And the other question I get is, okay, if someone does something on a Sunday evening that's legal, why should their employer care about it on Monday morning when they go to work? And the answer is, there are a number of circumstances where what you do off-duty as an employee can have ramifications for your employment with legal marijuana and many other things. So what you do off-duty can, in many circumstances, have ramifications for your employment, and negative ramifications. I'll give you a couple of U.S. examples in a minute. So with marijuana right now, one of the big concerns is that there is no defined method of testing for impairment There's urine testing, there's saliva testing, there's blood testing. There are benefits and drawbacks with each, but there's no recognized science like there is with alcohol, with a breathalyzer. I'm not going to get into that in the context of this discussion because time doesn't permit, but it is certainly a live issue that parties are struggling with right now. But I just pose a couple of questions for you. Leaving aside how we measure it, would you agree that if you are potentially too impaired to drive to work from marijuana, that you probably shouldn't be at work? I think that we would all probably agree with that, and I'm sure 100% of us would agree that if you are too impaired to drive to work because of marijuana, you shouldn't be in a safety-sensitive position. So you can't drive to work, but then you get to work and you get on a bobcat or a forklift or something like that and drive around. It doesn't sound intuitively smart to say that if you can't, you can be legally impaired in driving to work, but you can get to work and operate equipment. So, a few intersections that I want to talk about. First of all, marijuana and occupational health and safety. Employers have a statutory obligation to take all reasonably practicable steps to ensure the health and safety of their employees. It's an overarching obligation in the occupational health and safety legislation throughout Canada. And they've got moral obligations to protect their employees, legal obligations, and huge fines if they fail. So the intersection between OH&S and legal marijuana is just because it's legal doesn't mean that it overrides either the employee's obligation to be safe at work or the employer's obligation to keep the employee safe at work. If there was ever an accident at work because someone was impaired by marijuana, it would never be a defense for the employer or the individual to say, well, it was legal marijuana that I used and I used it legally. That is going to be no defense to occupational health and safety. So those obligations trump the legalization. As well, even leaving aside the OH&S issues, employers have an implicit right to expect that their employees come to work fit for duty. And if marijuana impairs that, that's an issue for an employer to deal with. I want to give you two examples of something that's gone on in the U.S. and talk a little bit about there, because of course, as you know, several states have legalized marijuana in the last few years, starting with Colorado, and we've got a couple of interesting examples here. This guy is Mike Boyer, and he stayed up all night to be the first in line and buy legal marijuana in Spokane when it became legalized. See the camera crew there. He bought it, he went home with the camera crew, went to his house, went to his living room, and smoked marijuana completely legally, and then proceeded to get fired from 2 of his 3 part-time jobs when it made the news that night. One of his employers drug tested him. He failed the test, was offside the policy. His comment to the media after he lost 2 of his 3 part-time jobs was he didn't care because this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be first in line and jobs come and go. So he was not gunning to be Employee of the Month. This guy, this is the first day of legalization in Seattle. And you can see the Ryder fan has made it down there to be in line. The guy behind him in the suit that looks like a lawyer is a lawyer. He is Pete Holmes, who is a lawyer with the city of Seattle. On his lunch break, went and bought some legal marijuana and then also made the news, went back to work, did not smoke it, just took it back to work. He breached his employer's policy that said, even though marijuana is legal, you can't bring it onto our workplace. And he decided to make a $3,000 donation to a crisis shelter, probably to keep himself from getting fired. So it can have ramifications even if it's legal activity otherwise vis-a-vis your employment. And here are some somewhat disturbing statistics from the U.S. So in Colorado, after legalization, 32% increase in marijuana-related traffic deaths. The percentage of U.S. adults across the states has doubled in 3 years. That's both because of legalization in certain states and also just greater popularity in the illegal markets. In Colorado, 1 in 4 adults used in the last month in this study. 1 in 8 are daily users. 12.5% of the adult population is a daily user in Colorado, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And interestingly, Colorado saw a huge problem with edibles, which is why if you look into the legalization in Canada, they didn't legalize edibles at this point. They said, we're going to deal with that down the road. And the reason why is the Colorado experience with edibles that Michael alluded to a little bit. You take one gummy bear, nothing happens. So you take another one, nothing happens. You take a couple of more, and then they all kick in. And then you're phoning the poison control line, which went up. The calls for marijuana poisoning or a feeling of marijuana poisoning went up 5 times after legalization. So they've certainly seen some issues in the United States. So here are the big picture problems with marijuana use from an employer's perspective. Unlike alcohol, you can look on a bottle, you can tell the alcohol content, you can do the math for the weight of the individual, what the effect is going to be on them. With marijuana, there's no such labeling. The THC can be anything from, as Michael pointed out, low numbers up to 30%, and a joint can be different sizes. So there's no real measurement on how much someone takes. The studies say that casual users are affected differently than regular users. Casual users will have a much more impairing effect very, very quickly. Long-term users will subjectively not feel impaired and will not have the same level of impairment as a casual user, but objectively, even though they don't feel impaired, objectively it's demonstrable that they in fact are impaired, so that creates its own sort of a problem. And the kicker that is a great concern for the employer community is the third bullet. There is credible evidence to suggest that regular users of marijuana will have a buildup of a sort of background level of THC that arguably puts them over what are going to be the legal cutoff limits for driving cars or vehicles after legalization in Canada. So what you do on a Sunday evening with legal marijuana may place you in a position where you are over the limit to drive to work the next morning, and I don't think that there's much information about that in Canada yet at this point. And I've cited a Health Canada statistic where they say impairment can last up to 24 hours. The Australian pilot study is very, very interesting. They took 10 experienced pilots, put them on a flight simulator, which of course measures everything that they're doing, and then gave them each a joint, and then 24 hours later put them back on the flight simulator. No one going back into that study felt any effects of impairment 24 hours later. Most of them in the group were demonstrably less capable 24 hours after consuming marijuana. And one individual in the study, as he landed the flight simulator, missed the runway. And I'm thinking that's probably a pretty important thing to be able to hit the runway if you're a pilot. So there is a demonstrable evidence that impairment does last as long as 24 hours. So the cutoff limits, which Ron Piché is going to be speaking about from a criminal law perspective, I'm just going to touch on, other than to just point out that the lowest cutoff limit is 2 nanograms per milliliter of THC in your blood. And if you are a daily user, if you're one of those 1 in 8 in Colorado, there's a very good argument that you will always be at or above the 2 nanograms per milliliter levels in your system. So basically, if you're using every day, you're not driving at all. So it's pretty fair to say that after legalization, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that use is going to increase, and everybody predicts this for 2 reasons. 1, the criminal stigma is going to be removed, and 2, now there's going to be legal access, so you'll both won't have any criminal sanction, and you'll have a source other than your local drug dealer to buy it. So use is going to go up. Now, let's look just very quickly to see whether there are safety issues with illegal marijuana right now. This is a study from 2016 with Manitoba Public Insurance. They pulled over 1,700 individuals in a random study, said, look, there are no ramifications. We want you to do a drug and alcohol test. There are no police here. This is entirely voluntary. Will you do this? 1,200 of the 1,700 asked agreed. And look at the statistics. 10% of the population tested over the generally accepted cutoff limits for these various drugs, marijuana being number one and cocaine being number two. So 10% of the population was over the cutoff limits, and that doesn't include the 500 people that declined to take the test, and my guess is that not all of them were just in a rush to get home for dinner. So you can assume that number is way low. And you can't even blame it on youth. As you see the breakdown, it's distributed right through the different age classifications. What they did find from a positive perspective is they got very few people that were over the legal cutoff limits for alcohol, but lots for drugs. So society seems to understand that you don't drink and drive, but we don't understand at this point that you don't smoke and drive. Now, here's another interesting study. You may have seen this in the news. There's a long history that I won't bore you with, but TTC in Toronto decided to do random testing of drugs and alcohol for its safety-sensitive employees. The union fought back and said, we disagree, it's going to arbitration. In the interim, they asked the union asked for an injunction preventing it from happening until they have the arbitration. The court said, no, we're going to allow it. And so this went on for months, and then the court gave the green light pending the arbitration. The employer announced this in advance, so everybody knew it was in effect. They randomly tested 8 workers on the first day and several sort of periodically after that. So with all of that heads up, when they tested those 8 individuals, 2 of the 8 failed. 1 failed for alcohol, 1 failed for drugs, and in subsequent tests, they've had several more people that have failed. So that's a scary statistic that suggests that we have problems right now. So there's 3 things that employers need to do that I'll touch on very, very briefly, and this is what employers are working on in the 6 months leading up to legalization. 1, they need to have policies that address legal marijuana. What are the rules, use, possession in the workplace, so employees have an understanding about what the expectations are. 2, you're going to see more and more employers have drug and alcohol testing policies where they have an opportunity to test employees, and the case law in Canada says that testing can occur in 4 situations. Probable cause, where you have reason to suspect someone in an accident or near miss, and as a return to work program for random testing for someone who's already broken the rules, and when you move into a safety sensitive position for the first time. And you can do the testing only in safety sensitive positions generally. A safety sensitive position is defined as a position where if you are impaired cognitively or your motor skills, you could cause potential injury or damage to yourself or others, plant or equipment, or the environment. So many positions, forklift operator, anybody in an industrial workplace would be safety sensitive. Just one more slide and then I'll wrap up here. So we're going to see drug testing in those types of situations, and finally educating employees, and this is where I see the information lacking right now, educating employees that what you do on the weekend can in fact affect your ability to perform your job safely on a weekday. And this is going to be what's going to be rolled out in the next 6 months with employers in Saskatchewan and throughout Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Lastly, we have Ron Pichet speaking to us. Ron Pichet is a criminal defense lawyer with Piché and Company based here in Saskatoon. His practice focuses primarily on the defense of motor vehicle charges, drug matters, and residential school litigation. Ron has defended motor vehicle offenses at all levels of court throughout Western Canada. A graduate of the U of S College of Law, Ron also holds a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of Ottawa and a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism from the University of Regina. Today, Ron will be speaking to us and focusing on marijuana impairment and driving offenses. Please join me in welcoming Ron Piché.
Thank you, Lisa. Sorry. I think last time I was holding a mic like this in my hand was at the karaoke celebration. We have time limits here, so I'm not going to get into the minutia of the new legislation. What I'd like to do is just illustrate by way of a given hypothetical what the new legislation might entail for unsuspecting motorists who are stopped by the police, and perhaps we can start from the beginning and work our way through. I think most of the law students who are present in the room here would be aware that police have virtually unlimited authority to stop a motor vehicle. The best way to explain this perhaps is the way it was put to me by one judge in Lloydminster, who said unless the officer stops the motorist to ask the driver what the lottery numbers were last night, then the stop is lawful. In other words, the police have long figured out that the stop is lawful if indeed they ask for the license, registration, and check for the sobriety. So right from the beginning, it's quite clear that the lawful authority is there. So with this new legislation, what happens now that the individual motorist is stopped? The new legislation enacts what's called a oral fluid drug screener. That's a fancy way of saying there's going to be a saliva test. And unlike, and I'm not going to talk about the changes with respect to impaired by alcohol, but unlike the impaired by alcohol changes, the police still need what's described as a reasonable suspicion to conclude that indeed this individual is under the influence of drugs. The test is not very high. The test is very similar to what we have now under the Yates case out of our Court of Appeal, which is essentially, if it's reasonably possible, that indeed there is drugs that are at play here, that indeed the oral fluid drug screen test can be used. What is that? It's simply a device that's inserted into the mouth. The grounds, again, need not be voluminous. In fact, some of the literature on that would be things like inability to speak fluidly, which again triggers issues about what if in fact the person has a legitimate speech impediment, that kind of thing. Nonetheless, once that test is administered, what it does detect is an array of potential drugs there. Now, a lot of the changes with respect to this legislation do impose, I guess, a little bit of a trust level. Everything from the legitimacy of the testing devices, because one of the first questions always is, in these kind of situations, will that saliva test detect old or stale or previously used THC levels or cocaine or methamphetamine, all this kind of thing. And of course, the literature, and this is largely coming from the federal government, is that no, it only tests for the active ingredient. In other words, the ingredient that would make that person high at the time. So again, as with the impaired driving legislation, I suspect that's going to be another, well, one of the first of many, many disputes that defense counsel will have with this form of legislation. Again, the struggle will always be, and I'm sure this does not come as a surprise to any law students who are in the room or lawyers who are like, the struggle will always be between addressing the carnage of impaired driving, be it by alcohol or drug, and your constitutional rights. Because indeed, what is being engaged here is a restriction to your mobility and the like. So once that individual is indeed tested and the result comes back that there is the presence of THC, and as I indicated, there's a whole array of drugs that this particular test tries to determine. Once that's done, then the suspect at that point, just like with an impaired driving suspect, is taken to the police station and then administered a blood test. Now, forecasting again the area of litigation here, our Supreme Court, in a case, I always say recent, but now it's become 6-7 years, has always said that breath samples are minimally intrusive. In other words, providing a breath sample, it does not intrude into the bodily integrity of an individual. Of course, that's going to change significantly when police can either obtain a blood sample or a urine sample from an individual. So again, all sorts of potential litigation as a result of that, largely because the intrusion into your bodily integrity, as I've indicated, is much higher under this new regime. Now, what the legislation does is it establishes 3 new criminal code offenses, and it's based on the nanograms per milliliters of blood. And the first range, and Kevin talked about this, he touched on it, they have established through regulation that between 2 and 5 nanograms for the first offense. This is a summary conviction offense, and the law students would be aware summary conviction usually dictates that it's being treated somewhat less seriously. Higher than 5 results in a hybrid offense. In other words, it can be preceded by indictment or summarily. Then you have a third category, and that category involves readings of 2.5 nanograms and alcohol of 50 milligrams percent or 0.05. A combination of that, again, will be treated as a hybrid indictable matter. The offenses trigger, of course, penalties. On the summary matter, there's a fine of not higher than $1,000. On the secondary ones, fines of not less than $1,000 plus the surcharge. Of course, we all know what's really at play here. It's not so much the $1,000 here or the $1,000 there. What's at play is the fact that this will result in a criminal record, and it will result potentially in a loss of license from the courts. But probably more important, the province has already responded on this, and they've indicated that anyone who's charged with this type of offense will automatically lose their license. There's a zero tolerance, and they will lose their license until the matter is disposed of. And I don't want to digress too much, but this is similar to the legislation with respect to impaired by alcohol, that in June of 2014, the province enacted legislation that said you will be suspended until your matter is disposed of. The difficulty with that is the people need their license for their livelihood in this province. Many of them do. And the courts weren't really prepared to address the situation where speedy trials were required to really address this whole issue of someone who's essentially been convicted without a trial. Now, what has happened is that Alberta, and perhaps their defense bar is a little bit more litigious than ours, perhaps a little bit more organized than ours, but they fought that to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal, in a bit of a surprising decision, struck down that legislation, saying it did indeed violate the charter because it violated the presumption of innocence. The previous view had always been, especially from the Supreme Court, that driving is a privilege, not a right, so it can be regulated as the provinces see fit. Now, without eating up all my time, just to finish that picture in Alberta, I think the defense bar were victims of their own success to some point, because at the end of the day, rather than appeal that decision to the Supreme Court, the Alberta government announced quite quietly, if I could put it that way, that all police would have the discretion to not even lay charges anymore. They would deal with it administratively, which meant seize your vehicle and lose your license for 90 days, but not be charged criminally. In any event, back to the impaired by drug situation. If indeed the blood or the urine shows the levels are higher than the legal limit, as I've indicated and outlined in the regulations, then of course the person is charged and the trial process ensues as it would in most cases. There's a litany of problems with this legislation, and when I say problems, I should say from the defense perspective, there's clearly issues. One of them, as a glaring example, and I'm not going to get through all of them, the legislation, the way it's worded, and I'm not quite sure this is an intentional thing or just a mistake, creates a scenario where an individual could actually have some foresight and say, I'm going out on the town tonight, take his vehicle, park it at an in-park somewhere near the bar, but in a safe location with no plans whatsoever to in fact imbibe in drugs or alcohol, go to the bar, encounter an officer not even while behind the wheel, and because of the 2-hour limitation under the legislation, the police, if they determine he had been driving within the 2 hours, can proceed with the testing all the way from the saliva to indeed the blood test. And this is an individual who had no intention of driving. So that's one of them. And again, maybe at some point that'll be clarified and rectified. The other issue, of course, is the lasting power of any of the drugs, and we've heard some reference to that already today. People have varying tolerances to THC, and an individual who's an experienced drug user may in fact be able to withstand an onslaught of 1-2 joints in a day and still not have the impairing effect of that drug. So in effect, what you're doing is you're using a rigid objective grid, in other words, the nanograms, which are suggesting that that individual might be impaired when he would not be. Now, you might ask, well, how about alcohol? There are, a limit, there's 0.8 and higher. It's a little bit different because the experts in alcohol, the toxicologists in alcohol, will say that at a certain level, everybody's indeed impaired by alcohol. Everybody would be showing indices of impairment, stuttering, red bloodshot eyes, lack of balance, all these kind of things. So there's a more firm guidelines with respect to the blood alcohol concentrations with alcohol. I don't think the same can be said with respect to THC, and I keep saying THC because that's going to be the likely the drug of choice in these kind of situations. So there's a subjective element here. There is the tolerance that someone develops from experienced use of marijuana, who may be perfectly fit to drive, and that's a concern. There's also the medicinal marijuana aspect here. People who have bona fide reasons, medical reasons for marijuana, may find themselves caught by this very wide brush of legislation. Contrast that with the UK. The UK has statutorily, that is in its statute, identified the exception for medical marijuana. It's not a get out of jail free card. What it is, though, is in fact, if you can establish this, you can avoid conviction. So that's important as well. We all know, and we all know that, and certainly the federal government has recognized this with the legislation, that marijuana continues to be a part of our social fabric. That's very clear. Some of the stats show that young people in North America between the ages of 18 and 24, 66% of them have smoked or imbibed in marijuana in the past year. 100% of them, or close to 100%, they said the vast majority in the last 2 years have consumed marijuana at least once. So that is the reality. Of course, the concern is indeed that we're going to be experiencing more people whose faculties are impaired while they drive. The other issue that arises in this is it took the committees and the like a lot of research, a lot of effort to try to establish what the impairing levels are with respect to THC. And again, they're not uniform around the world. The UK has a different standard. They're down to the 1 nanogram. We're between 2 and 5 and up. But other countries are even higher. So again, and that's not unusual because even with alcohol, there's varying limits, there's varying grids out there. The other concern that we're going to have here is that both the saliva testing or the oral fluid drug screeners have to have some training for this. There also is the concern of having the blood or the urine shipped for testing. Now, anybody who practices a lot of criminal law knows that the labs are laden, they're just brimming with these type of requests. And typically it might take 3 to 4 months to get results back. Remember what SGI is already doing with respect to this. You're being suspended until you're driving, even though there's not even a blood test that's come back yet. As long as the charges have been laid, that's what SGI will use to indeed suspend your license until the matter's resolved. So there's going to be what I would consider a very, very active resistance, if you will, and I'm not suggesting that lawyers are playing lawyer or the like. What they are doing is looking at what is probably the most litigated area in the criminal law, that is impaired driving, either by alcohol or drugs. And those are always challenges to our constitutional rights because it's typically law-abiding citizens, unfortunately, who do get caught up in this type of criminal activity. It's not your typical criminal, if one could put it that way. And I see Lisa's already got the hook for me, so I'll limit it at that. And hopefully, if there are unanswered questions, that's what we're here for in terms of the panel session. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ron. I know some students have to get off to other classes, but we do have a panel planned. So I'd ask the panelists if you could just come have a seat over at your name tags. And then for anyone who's remaining in the audience, Katie is going to just set up, I think, over on this side of the room. And she'll have a second microphone. So if anyone has a question, please line up near Katie over there. And she can take your questions for the panel. And I'll just give everyone a moment to get settled. I'm just going to grab my water. Sure.
Test, test. Testing, 1, 2.
Okay, so I think we'll get started with the panel portion now. Were there any questions coming from the audience? Again, Katie is just to my left.
I can come to them too.
Sorry. What?
I can go out to you guys too. if
Yes,
you
and
wanna raise
Katie
your
can
hand.
meet you as well.
Now that it's cleared out a little. Sorry, just talking to the end.
No, that's okay. So my question is, Michael, you were the first speaker, correct? Okay. So my question was for you, and I guess it kind of also leads into some of the stats that came out of the second presentation as well, out of Colorado. So you had talked about some of the ramifications of this being that we might see an increase in mental health concerns. So I'm a mental health practitioner, just full disclosure, so that's why this matters to me. So what I was thinking about is sort of the fact that we're not the first country to legalize marijuana, right? And so we want to be conscious of what's emerged in other countries when we're thinking about what some of the potential impacts are. So I'd be curious to know what the stats are, not just out of our neighbors to the south, because they're relatively new in sort of their legalization process as well, but what some of maybe even the Scandinavian countries and others have seen in their legalization processes, just because when I'm trying to make that link in my mind, it would give me the impression that if we legalize, or when we legalize, that we're liable to see an increase in use strictly because of the legalization of the product. And so I'd be curious if you could speak to that a little bit.
So right now in, say, well, the Netherlands and where it's been legalized, one of the issues is when you're trying to compare research is the version of marijuana that's being used. And so quite often in the Netherlands, for a long period, very low levels of THC varieties were used. And again, they are the ones that you are less at risk with for some of the major serious side effects. It wasn't until about the mid-90s where all of a sudden these more intense, more THC potent strains came around. And so Scandinavian countries and that are also struggling with, you know, what are the impacts now going to be because of the changing demographics for the actual plant itself. Sure. Yes, yeah. That's right, yeah, yeah.
There's not another question directly to Katie right now, and certainly raise your hand if there is, but I am just going to jump in with a question of my own. From the employer and university standpoint, I'm wondering if you can speak, Kevin, a little bit to any anticipated differences between the medical marijuana legislation and sort of regime that's in place now, and how that will or potentially may contrast with a recreational legalized marijuana in the employer's culture.
Thanks, Lisa. Well, medical marijuana is a completely separate regime involving human rights, a duty to accommodate, and it's a completely separate issue or topic than what we've discussed today. There is going to be interaction between legal marijuana and medical marijuana. My theory is that the requests for medical authorizations are going to drop substantially because there's no doubt that many people are getting a medical authorization just to legalize recreational use, and now they won't have to do that anymore. The employers do, if it is legitimate treatment and a medical condition, an employer does have a human rights duty to accommodate that, which again sort of goes far beyond what we can go through today. So those obligations will exist in those situations post-legalization, but in the context of legalization, there's no such human rights implications. It's a choice an employee is determining to make, and going back to my presentation, if it affects their employment or their ability to perform their employment, it potentially places their job at risk.
Looks like we have another question.
Hello. So there was it was mentioned how above a certain concentration THC could possibly involve or acute psychological effects. Although there's also I believe there are cannabinoids that have countering or attenuating effects on those same potential psychosis. So, isn't it that could add a complication too, because there are things countering the effects of the THC in the same plant that has the THC. So, I'm just wondering if you would have a comment on that.
I didn't focus on one of the believed antipsychotics that's found in cannabis is cannabidinol. I can't say it right. CBD is the acronym. And so what happens is what they called the heritage variety, that from, say, the 1960s, and much of the medicinal marijuana has low THC. And the interesting thing is a marijuana plant can only produce a total amount of THC and CBD. So if that plant has been altered in some way to create more THC, it actually then forces the plant to produce less CBD. So the medicinal strains actually have quite a significant amount of CBD still in them, and they're are even some medicinal strains that are prescribed that have a ratio of 20:1 CBD to THC. But unfortunately, the street variety, which is now the high THC level versions, they've been breeding out selectively. They didn't know that CBD was going with it, but they now, at the expense of the CBD, have all this THC. And so one of the arguments that I have heard for why we don't see in people who were chronic users for a long time, who use the more medicinal varieties, we don't see a lot of mental health issues in that population, is they're actually using a variety that has the CBD in it, and so even they are actually treating their own mental health issue by smoking. Again, there isn't a lot of evidence that that's true or false, but that there are some anecdotal tales out there that is the case. But one of the things I flipped over my slide because I ran out of time was about the research aspect, and this is one area where they really do need to do a lot more research. I hope I answered your question.
We have another question at the back.
Thanks for coming and presenting on this difficult topic, but I wanted to ask, you made a statement that with legalization there might be fewer applications for medical licenses, but I wonder if you couldn't argue the opposite from a labor legal standpoint, that more people would apply for licenses because they would get special considerations at work.
Kevin, would you
I would agree with you that there is speculation whether the medical licenses are going to go up or down after legalization, and there are people that are predicting that it's going up. My prediction is down, so I'll take your bet.
Katie's making her way over to another question.
Hi, I have a question kind of for Michael and Ron. Full disclosure, like Aaron, I'm responsible for the delivery of addiction services through our regional health authority, or I should say the provincial health authority, sorry. Ron, you mentioned numbers of young people using marijuana, basically 100% in the last 2 years have used it. Michael, you mentioned that there would be perhaps an increase in the utilization. I'm not sure how you can get more than 100% of utilization, but my question is, you mentioned around concerns around increasing healthcare costs. So what I see now is young people that are acquiring illegal drugs, 100% of them basically, and using drugs that are very high toxicity, laced with fentanyl, laced with meth. We are seeing in our system kids coming forward with very high medical needs because they're in distress because of what the drugs are laced with. So developing psychosis because of that, etc. So I'm thinking of a harm reduction approach that we can actually regulate a product and make it safer, because we already know 100% of those kids are using it, and actually decreasing healthcare costs because we're not dealing with them at such an acute level. So just interested in your thoughts on that.
So I mean, it is one of these things that you have to look into a crystal ball and see what's going to happen. Like the study that my students and I published, it was about a 40% rate of people who were aged 18 to 25 were actually using, we didn't see 100%. And of that group, again, you're right, if you're from a harm reduction, right, people are going out buying what I on lecture call pothead Fred's variety from the street corner, which could be laced with who knows what. And you're right, fentanyl is something that is being seen now, as well as formaldehyde has been in there. And so there are issues, but the thing, so again, I don't know in that $51 billion cost that they say for treating mental health issues, like they haven't teased out which portion is related to mental health issues and the component because of drug use. They haven't. So if the volume of people stay the same, and yes, I agree, then the cost could go down if people are buying it from a controlled source, right? And that's where one of my final comments was, I really do hope that the government will regulate the amount of THC that will be available in a particular product, because again, that helps mitigate some of the risk. I don't know if does that answer your question.
Yeah, approaching this from the perspective of driving while impaired, you're absolutely right to raise the point that there's more out there than THC and the like. From the legislation's point of view, the testing does also consider cocaine, fentanyl, and the like, and from the perspective of a, if you will, a civil libertarian, the concern there is that it does not measure amounts at all with respect to those other drugs, especially on the saliva test. So even the most minute kind of trace would lead to the further investigation and the like. But you're right to point out that we're dealing with more than just marijuana here, especially in this legislation. Frankly, I don't know if they've thought out the minutia of the other drugs to the extent that they did with THC. But we can't be blind to the fact that there's other drugs that are prevalent out there. Yeah.
While Katie's making her way over to Mark, I'm going to pose a question to Ron. Currently, with the legislation we have in place, we see with impaired by drug investigations a lot of field sobriety testing done with the physical tests. Do you anticipate seeing the same amount, more? What is your analysis about the impending legislation, and how much does the subjective opinion of an officer come into that?
Well, it's a good question, Lisa. I think what's going to happen with the new legislation is clearly they've streamlined the process. It's akin to the approved screening device, which was a novel situation not that many years ago with respect to screening for any alcohol in the person of the accused. That's what the saliva test is going to be doing. So rather than engaging in a standard field sobriety test, which is subjective, which is time consuming, which may or may not, I should say it does not, because I did argue this in the Court of Appeal, trigger rights to counsel. Clearly it did not. What we're going to have now is a more streamlined, accepted instrument that will measure these things. And, there's good and bad with that. The good is that it will be hopefully quick, as it is with the ASD. That is, it has to be administered forthwith, and will be conclusive, and the investigation either continues or it ends at that time. So I think that's a positive step for law enforcement. I think the police will have a tool. Whether or not that instrument is scientifically acceptable, I will save that for cases down the road.
On the line of the question